Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. Last week's episode was a bit much for a lot of people. Some of my most dedicated listeners messaged me to say they just couldn't do it. So, I thought this week I would take it easy on you and do more of a mysterious death versus a murder case. And don't get me wrong, it is still horrific. 6 people died. There was one survivor, and you would think her recollection would explain what happened, but 30 years later, it still remains a mystery. Early on in my podcasting career, I covered the story of the Dyatlov Pass. I believe it was season 3, episode 2. To recap, in 1959, a group of 9 hikers were found dead in the Ural Mountains of Russia. Their tents were cut open from the inside, indicating they needed to get out in a hurry. The temperatures were sub-zero, yet many of the bodies were found without any clothing. More than one person had their eyes gouged out and tongue removed. These deaths have everyone stumped to this day. Theories range from an avalanche to hypothermia, aliens, a Yeti, or the KGB being responsible. Over 3 decades later, a similar incident happened to another group of hikers in the Russian mountains of Siberia. This is the Khamar-Daban Incident. The year is 1993. 41-year-old Lyudmila Korovina was head of the Petropavlov Tourist Club, where she worked as a hiking and survivalist instructor. Tourists would travel from great distances specifically to hike with Lyudmila. A previous student said, quote, "She knew how to unite everyone, make a team. She believed in people. She could make a person become who he really is. Under her mentoring, each of us managed to maximize our ability, grow in all spheres of life." Unquote. That summer, she planned a hike with 6 of her students in the Khamar-Daban mountain range of Southern Siberia. This mountain range was a popular spot to hike for both locals and tourists. Lyudmila was very familiar with the area, and this particular hike was a level 3, 5 being the most extreme, meaning this wasn't the most difficult, but it wouldn't be a piece of cake leisurely hike either. This would allow her students to put their skills to the test. It was considered to be relatively safe, especially in the summer months. Temperatures were not expected to get below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The students, and bear with me for these pronunciations, were 23-year-old Alexander, who went by Sasha Krysin, 24-year-old Tatiana Filipenko, 19-year-old Denis Shvakin, 17-year-old Valentina, who went by Valia Udachenko, 16-year-old Victoria Zalasova, and the youngest was 15-year-old Timur Bapanov. Lyudmila knew Sasha from outside of her class. They were actually very close, and she considered him more like a son rather than just her student. August 2nd, the group of 7 met in the village of Marino to begin their adventure. There were 2 other groups of hikers that were going to be in the area at that same time. One group was held by Lyudmila's 16-year-old daughter, Natalia. Natalia must be following in her mother's footsteps. Pretty badass to be leading level 3 hikes at that age. They planned to meet up on August 5th when their hiking routes would cross. The weather was supposed to be perfect. The forecast called for clear skies and warm temperatures. The first 2 days went great. Better than expected, actually. They were ahead of schedule. Lyudmila packed food rations for the group, but also foraged plants along the way. They collected goldenroot, berries, mushrooms, etc. They made it to the Retranslator Peak and began their descent on August 4th. That is when the weather took a turn. A cyclone swept through the area. Even though sunny skies were predicted, they did come prepared for various types of weather. They brought heavier clothing and jackets. But the severe rainstorm completely soaked their packs. This slowed the hikers down quite a bit as it became heavier and heavier on their backs. Realizing her students were completely exhausted, Lyudmila decided to stop on the side of the mountain and set up camp for the night. The area was open and exposed. Many question why the group set up camp here, as their tents were being pounded with heavy winds and rain. Not far down the mountain was a patch of trees, and there was a designated rest area with shelter about 30 minutes back towards the peak. It is surprising that Ludmila didn't push the group a little further into either of those directions. It would have given far more protection from the elements. But if even just one of her students wasn't able to move any further due to exhaustion, she would have been forced to stop where they were. She is responsible for these people and can't leave anyone behind. Or possibly this was done on purpose. Ludmila wasn't just a hiking instructor, she was a survivalist. Maybe she wanted to show the group how to survive in these extreme elements. Due to the recent downpour, they were not able to find dry wood or kindling to start a fire. Around 4 a.m., they were awakened by sounds of the tents buckling due to the wind and rain. They attempted to repair the damage and go back to sleep. But at 6 a.m., the group woke up to wet sleeping bags and were unable to get any real rest at that point. They were somehow able to get a fire going and cooked breakfast that morning. They packed up and started walking around 11 a.m. It was now August 5th, the day Ludmila's group was to cross paths with Natalia's hiking group. But when Natalia and her hikers arrived at the designated meeting spot, her mother was not there. After waiting a while and she still didn't show, Natalia moved on, thinking Ludmila was possibly just behind schedule due to the unplanned storm. On August 10th, 8 days after the beginning of their journey, a pair of Ukrainian tourists were kayaking down a river at the base of the Khamar-Daban Mountains. They noticed something along the tree line. As they paddled closer, they saw it was a girl. She was alone and just standing there, staring, almost in a trance. She wasn't flagging them down for help or anything, but something just seemed off. The kayakers decided to turn around and make sure she was okay. As they approached, they noticed she was covered in dried blood. She snapped out of her trance and became hysterical. The girl was 17-year-old Valentina Udachenko, one of the hikers in Ludmila's group. They took her back to their camp and gave her a mug of vodka. Screw water. This is Russia, and she obviously went through something traumatic. Get this girl some vodka. But all Valia could say was that she was one of a 7-person hiking group and everyone else was dead. The kayakers escorted her to a hospital as it was obvious she needed medical attention. Authorities were also brought in so that she could provide a formal statement. But Valia didn't talk. She was in shock and remained tight-lipped as to what happened to her hiking companions. In fact, she wouldn't tell her story until years later. Because Valia was so traumatized and unable to speak, it took weeks to find the other hikers. They were indeed deceased. Their bodies were bloated and decomposing. Some were missing their eyes and tongues, a similarity to the victims of the Dyatlov Pass. In the story of the Dyatlov Pass, some theorized this was a message from the Russian military or government conducting secret experiments. Like, you didn't see anything and now you can't say anything. Or it was done by a creature like the mythical Yeti. This time around, in the Khamar-Daban Incident, the missing eyes and tongues were thought to be from scavengers. They tend to go for soft tissues first, which does make sense. Similarly to the autopsies in the Dyatlov Pass incident, these hikers' cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. All except for the leader, Ludmila. Her death was listed as a heart attack. Other things noted in the autopsy was that all 6 hikers had bruised lungs and a protein deficiency due to malnutrition, which is interesting because Valia said they ate well, around 2,500 calories per day, but perhaps that caloric intake was not enough. As I said, years later, Valia came forward to speak out about her experience on August 5th, 1993. Here is her story. That morning, after the group finished their breakfast, they packed up and began their descent. Sasha told Ludmila he wasn't feeling well and even stumbled a few times. Other members of the group offered to carry his pack to lighten his load. Then, out of nowhere, he began screaming. Everyone turned around to see blood running from his eyes, nose, and ears. He was frothing at the mouth and soon fell to the ground. Ludmila ran to Sasha's side to assess him. She instructed the others to keep walking towards the tree line and seek shelter, as it was still raining. As the 5 of them walked away, something just didn't feel right. They turned back to stay close to their leader. Tatiana grabbed a tent out of her pack in an attempt to put up a temporary shelter. When Ludmila noticed Tatiana, she shouted to stop what she was doing and seek shelter in the trees. Valia grabbed the hand of her friend, Victoria, and pulled her in the direction of the trees. Victoria resisted and lifted Valia's hand to her mouth, biting her, which seemed completely out of character. These two were best friends. Valia dragged Victoria by her hair, kicking and screaming towards the trees. Just then, Sasha started convulsing and his body went limp. Shortly following this, Ludmila showed the same symptoms: bleeding from her eyes, nose, and ears. Her body was convulsing, and then the group witnessed foam spill from her mouth as Ludmila collapsed on top of Sasha. The remaining 5 hikers were hysterical. Within minutes, their leader and most experienced student horrifically died right in front of their eyes. 24-year-old Tatiana Filipenko ran over to Ludmila in disbelief. Within seconds, Tatiana reached up to her throat and turned to her fellow hikers. Her eyes were wide as if signaling to them that she couldn't breathe. Then came the blood pouring from her orifices. Tatiana fell to the ground and dragged her body to a nearby rock where she began smashing her head off of it repeatedly until she went still. Realizing it was not safe to go near the bodies, Dennis turned and hid behind a large rock. Victoria and Tamir took off running while Valia stood motionless in complete shock. Victoria and Tamir collapsed while running. They began clawing at their throats, ripping apart their clothes. They also had blood spilling from their eyes and frothing at the mouth before they ultimately died just like the others. Valia and Dennis locked eyes. They were the only 2 hikers left alive. They took off towards the trees as fast as they could, but Dennis collapsed and began convulsing. Valia did not stick around to help. She just kept running. She didn't stop until she reached the safety of the trees. All Valia had on her was a backpack with a small tarp. She used that to shield herself from the elements and eventually drifted off to sleep. When Valia woke up alone, she suddenly remembered the tragic events. She was honestly shocked to still be alive. Whatever it was that happened to the rest of her group somehow evaded her. Valia realized if she was going to survive, she needed to hike back up to her group and scavenge their supplies. Valia was absolutely terrified and feared for her life, but she had no other choice. She slowly approached the closest member of the group, which was Dennis. When he collapsed, she kept running. Valia assumed he died like the others, and now that assumption was confirmed. She opened his pack and took what she found valuable. Then she went further up the mountain and found everyone else exactly where they collapsed the day before. She quickly grabbed a tent, food rations, and any other supplies she may need for survival. She continued walking down towards the river. She saw power lines and followed them, hoping to find civilization. What she found was an old abandoned town, not a soul around. She walked back towards the river and followed it for days. And this is where the kayakers found Valia staring in a catatonic trance. Valia was surprised to hear the cause of death was hypothermia and or a heart attack, as that does not match her recollection of events. Like the Dyatlov Pass incident, there are many potential theories out there to try and explain what happened to the hikers. So, let's explore those theories now. Starting with hypothermia. First of all, this was summer. The average temperature during their hike was supposed to be around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, not exactly hypothermia temps. At the time of their death, it had been raining for a solid 24 hours. Being drenched and walking through high winds would definitely make it feel much, much colder. So is it possible that the rain was a contributing factor? Yes. But what typically happens to your body when experiencing hypothermia is a gradual loss of energy, shivering, numbness in your extremities. You become lethargic and eventually just lay down and pass away. It's not a sudden death like Valia reported happening. And this was boom, one right after another. Their bodies wouldn't give out at the exact same moments. In extreme cases of hypothermia, you may feel very warm as your body dilates blood vessels in an attempt to warm freezing tissue in your limbs. And in these cases, people feel hot and will shed their clothing. Because some of the hikers were found without clothing, hypothermia seemed to be their answer. If it was hypothermia, why was Valia not affected? She was by no means the biggest or strongest of the group, and she continued to survive for days following this event. Does hypothermia cause bleeding from your eyes and foaming at the mouth? No. But Valia kept her story to herself for years. People wondered how credible it really was, and if trauma and time skewed her perception of events. The next theory is a military experiment. Potentially, the hikers witnessed something they shouldn't have and were killed to keep it quiet. Similar to a theory in the Dyatlov Pass incident. They did go off their planned route, and perhaps that led them to where a group of experimenters were hiding in the mountains. Medical examiners and police then cover up the conspiracy by claiming hypothermia. I know Valia was in shock and not speaking, but I find the 3-week time frame it took to find the bodies suspicious. They were using helicopters, and Natalia knew where Ludmila's planned route was. Part of me believes the delay in discovery was on purpose, to allow time for the bodies to decompose and hide any evidence of what really happened. There are quite a few things wrong with this theory, one being that Valia survived. If the hikers died because of something they witnessed, why would they allow Valia to get away? And she didn't report seeing anything of the sort. This mountain was a popular spot for tourism and very unlikely place for the military to conduct secret experiments. Having said that, maybe they didn't witness the experiment. What if it was done higher up in the mountain, and depending on what it was, say chemical weaponry, the heavy rain could have caused the chemicals to flow downhill and reach the hikers. A chemical that was heavily looked into here was an extremely deadly nerve agent called Novichok gas. This gas was created by Russian scientists and reportedly tested in the area at some point prior to 1993. Nerve agents are soluble in water. They can take up to 4 months to evaporate. They are made of heavy particles that often float close to the ground, and stronger agents can be hazardous long after they are first released. Symptoms of Novichok gas exposure include foaming at the mouth and convulsions. It can leave a human with bruising of the lungs and cardiac arrest, explaining what was found with the hikers during their autopsy. Pretend this is what happened. Sasha crossed the heavily contaminated area first, Ludmila putting herself in danger by sitting next to him. The others may have been exposed to smaller doses of the gas and one at a time followed their fate. Perhaps Valia was just lucky to avoid the chemical, or her body somehow had a tolerance or immunity. Although that seems unlikely because Novichok gas is extremely deadly. But Valia did go back to the bodies of the dead hikers to scour through the packs, and was not affected by anything that second day either. I feel this is a strong theory, but if there were 3 groups of hikers on the mountain at this time, why were the others not affected? Another theory is that the group drank from contaminated water source. After some time passed, they all started showing the same symptoms. Maybe Valia drank less water or got her water from a different source. But again, Would contaminated water produce bleeding from your eyes, nose, and ears? I can maybe understand the foaming at the mouth and convulsing, but I don't think this one adds up. What if the hikers weren't actually bleeding from their eyes and ears? What if Valya was hallucinating? I stated earlier that Ludmila was a forager. Perhaps they gathered mushrooms to cook with breakfast that were not the correct variety. Psilocybin is the naturally occurring compound in over 200 types of mushrooms that can make them, quote, psychedelic. A common hallucination caused by psilocybin is to see other people cry blood. Overdoses of psilocybin can cause psychosis, convulsions, cardiac arrest, and even death. Maybe Valya ingested some mushrooms, but less than the rest of the group, or again has some sort of tolerance. That would explain why she hallucinated but survived. They ate breakfast together, meaning digestion kicked in while walking as they all started feeling the effects around the same time. But if this is a known theory, you'd think Valya would confirm or debunk consuming mushrooms for breakfast. But maybe by the time she shared her story, those details have left her memory. Some believe the hikers' deaths were caused by low-frequency sound waves. Karma's vortex street is the unsteady separation of flow of a fluid around blunt objects. For example, the singing of suspended power lines and the vibration of a car antenna at certain speeds. The cyclone winds hit the domed summit of the mountain. Small tornadoes spin off the sides, causing deafening roars as well as a disorienting feeling caused by infrasound. Infrasound is a very low frequency, inaudible sound waves that excite the hair cells of the inner ear, sending messages to the brain even though no sound is perceived. This induces panic, breathing trouble, and fear. If severe enough, it could cause rupturing of the blood vessels, leading to the bleeding from the ears and nose reported by Valya. If severe enough, it could cause rupturing of blood vessels, leading to the bleeding of the ears and nose reported by Valya, and potentially bruising of the lungs. I would love to know what you think happened to these 6 hikers. Do you favor one of these theories listed or have a new theory to share? Drop a comment here on YouTube or on my social media. Facebook and Instagram at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at KillerStoryPod. I'm also curious if you like this type of story. I know it's straying a bit from true crime, but I'm always interested in the strange, dark, and mysterious as well. I wanted to give you all a heads up that I will not have an episode out next week. I'm going to spend some time with my niece and brand new little nephew, but I will be back the following week with a new killer story. If you would like to support the show, visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. You can leave a written review or rating on Spotify, always helpful. Speaking of reviews, thank to Lored3 for giving me 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. They followed me from my British collab, Stuart Blues. Greatly appreciate that. Perhaps the best way to show support is spread the love. Tell all your true crime loving friends to subscribe to Killer Stories. As always, thanks for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.